for Executive Education. Today, Nii will be presenting on the intersection of Africa's critical and rare earth minerals into Western supply chains. We ask that you hold your questions to the end of Nii's presentation. And for transparency, this session is being recorded and will be available for viewing upon request after today's session. Please join me in welcoming Mr. Simmonds, and Nii, please take it away.
Cool, great. I believe I'm muted. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you, Abiodun, for the kind intro. Distinguished guests, and friends, my name is Nii Simmonds. Hope you guys are well. The next hour or so, we're going to dive deep into critical rare earth minerals, what they are, why are they important, and what makes them so unique, and how Africa is now becoming the nexus between global superpowers and the geopolitics with some of these minerals. My talk will go into about 4 different parts. I will discuss each part in detail. From that, I will talk about the ramifications, the implications, and what it means for trade competitiveness and national security. So the first part, I'll talk about what are critical rare earth minerals, why do they matter. Second, I'll talk about what do they mean to consumer, industrial, and defense sectors. Third, I'll talk about how the West can secure these minerals and support the growth for the continent. And 4, I'll talk about what African countries need to do to support the growth of this sector, and how they can focus on value addition, R&D, commercialization, and what are the ramifications around governance and labor issues, right? But before I begin, I think I want to show just a quick video. And let me just share the screen. 1 second. Great. And then let me open this up.
Rare earths are essential for high-tech products, everything from electric vehicles to mobile phones and even fighter jets. However, China dominates the supply chain, and as relations between the US and China deteriorate, Western countries fear they don't have an alternative, which could have serious implications for the future of manufacturing. Rare earths are a group of 17 metallic elements with obscure names such as lanthanum and terbium. They are actually relatively plentiful in the Earth's crust. However, their geochemical qualities mean they tend to be widely dispersed, making them relatively difficult to mine and process profitably, hence the name. As a group, they tend to have high melting and boiling points, but it is when they react with other elements that they become really useful. In fact, they are indispensable for many electronic, optical, and magnetic applications, and currently irreplaceable for modern devices such as electric vehicles and mobile phones. They are also vital for the defense industry. Half a century ago, the Mountain Pass mine in California was the world's leading source of rare earths. But a successful push by Beijing to become the global leader in the sector means it now produces about 80% of the world's rare earths. The sharp deterioration in relations between the US and China is fueling concerns that Beijing could cut off the supply. In July, China threatened to impose sanctions on Lockheed Martin, the biggest US arms manufacturer. This has prompted the US, Australia, and the EU to step up efforts to create an alternative supply chain. Currently, there is just one major non-Chinese supplier of rare earths, Lynas, an Australian-listed company. But Lynas can only handle the so-called light rare earths at its Malaysian processing facility, leaving Western companies totally reliant on Chinese suppliers for heavy rare earths. In July, the Pentagon provided funding to Lynas and US-based MP Materials to design heavy rare earth processing facilities that could be based in the US. The US and Australian governments have also signed an agreement to source new rare earth deposits to boost security of supply. The task of establishing a non-Chinese supply chain will not be easy, however. Even though rare earths are relatively abundant, the process of separating them poses technical and environmental challenges. China's dominance of the market enables it to control prices and put pressure on challengers. Beijing's Made in China 2025 strategy is to create a vertically integrated supply chain that dominates mining, magnets, and high-tech manufacturing, such as electric vehicles. But an increasing number of Western experts say this is exactly why the West needs to begin producing its own supply of rare earths, and also the high-performance magnets required to power the digital age. Otherwise, millions more high-tech jobs could migrate to China.
Okay. So the reason I showed that video was it was very, very important for everybody to realize. Let me get out of this video real quick. It was very important for everybody to realize how important critical rare earth minerals are to global supply chains, especially Western supply chains. Africa controls Africa has a third of the world's deposits. Countries such as DRC, Democratic Republic of Congo, Zimbabwe, South Africa, Namibia, Nigeria, Ghana, other countries are countries that have enormous deposits. Some are only found in one or two countries, right? Lithium, the biggest deposits are in DRC. Cobalt there too. So what I'll do is I'll talk about the first part. What are critical minerals? In the video it talked about rare earths, but I'll get into that in a second. Critical minerals are really critical in the eyes of the beholder, right? U.S. Geological Survey, USGS, they're based out in Northern Virginia. They have identified rare earths, but critical minerals are, as I said, they're critical in the eyes of the beholder. But most people are most professionals are in extractive industries, and others who are in this in energy or in the defense or consumer electronics sectors would agree. There's a handful of critical minerals that are essential for various sectors. I mentioned cobalt, lithium. As we get into the net zero, and it's very important that we, the materials used to make electric vehicle batteries are powering this new energy revolution. Net zero is trying to get below 1.5 degrees Celsius to lower greenhouse gases. I'm not sure we'll meet that, but these critical minerals are key to mitigate the rise of the gases for this planet. In a video, they talk about consumer, industrial, and defense sectors. There's certain minerals that are critical for consumer electronics and industrial and defense. If anybody has had a MRI scan, the machine itself, there's these powerful magnets that are powered by gallium, which is a mineral that's used in semiconductors, integrated circuits, magnets, batteries. These materials are key for the gallium is key for the production of the photography or the X-rays or not even X-rays, the magnetic resolution of your body to make sure that the doctors know what's going on. Semiconductors. I'll talk a little bit about the US-EU Chips Act. Those two acts in itself reared its head, were implemented because of really the pandemic. I know there are many consumers that were waiting in almost a year for certain vehicle products, and they had to wait because certain components, semiconductors, weren't weren't available for the production for that vehicle. The average, this is a side note, the average car, especially I'll just say SUV. An SUV could have something like, I don't know, let's say take Tesla. The Tesla car could probably have anywhere up to 10 to 20 NVIDIA chips in it. And that's not even including all the flash memory and all the integrated circuits, right? So, if you multiply that by thousands for that particular model, and then, a particular segment, you can see how important critical minerals are for at least the automotive industry. We talk about industrial magnets that are used for electric motors. We talked about EVs. The motor for the electric motor for most cars, and motors are in everything. They're in your elevator. They're in your TV. They're in your fan. Copper is used by other materials. On the defense side, the F-35 that Lockheed Martin makes, there's so many critical rare earth minerals that are being used for the production of that plane, that fighter jet. And I'm sure there are people at the Pentagon who are not only concerned, but they want to make sure they can secure these supplies, and Africa is the epicenter for all this, right? And then we're talking about I talked a bit about the U.S. U.S. and EU U.S. Science and Chips Act and the EU Chips Act. Those two acts in itself were really focused on nearshoring the production of semiconductors, flash memory, other critical components of the manufacture of the semiconductor and flash memory supply chains, to make to have a production of those two industries. You need rare earth minerals, right? You need gases. After the war in Russia and Ukraine, or the war in Ukraine, which Russia started, there's certain gases that Ukraine and Russia produce, and now there are many manufacturers that are trying to figure out where do they source these two gases, right? So two critical events that have happened, the pandemic and the war in Russia, has really reared critical minerals in its ugly head about, and put Africa in a limelight, because now people are looking at the continent to say, well, how do we secure these critical minerals, and how can we? I mean, if you talk in DC, there's a buzz about the critical rare earth minerals, right? And if you're a foreign policy person who's in the energy space, or you're in the natural resources, I'm sure you've heard these discussions. But for me, as a first generation Ghanaian American, I'm American. I was born here, but I have I'm very concerned that the policymakers are only concerned about securing these raw materials in Africa, right? And this is a bipartisan agreement. If you I've talked to some EU officials in Brussels, and they're also concerned. But one of the things that I say is, okay, well, if you're concerned, that's good, but what are you going to do about it? And then they really don't know, right? If a third of the deposits of critical rare earth minerals come from Africa, and you're trying to secure it, and you can't compete with China because China brings in infrastructure. China produces roads, bridges, highways, physical things. How do you compete? And one of the arguments I'm making is we need to incentivize the U.S. private sector and have them secure, or have them extend their supply chains to Africa, right? And things like extending your R&D, focus on commercialization, getting some African countries to look at the potential opportunities for this, and then engaging your diaspora. Those are the key things that I think are very, very important for to support the growth of the continent, especially when the continent will scale from, I think we're right now about 1.5 billion people, one and a half billion, almost 1.5 billion people. We're just under 500, but in the next 20, 25 years, the continent will scale to 2.5 billion people, right? So what does that mean for the growth of the continent? How do we create jobs? How do we create food? And this is a really opportune way for some of these U.S. multinational, U.S. and Western multinationals to extend their supply chain. And that last and the fourth part, what can African countries do to have an environment, to have an investment climate where they can attract these companies so that they can focus on value addition, right? I've written a couple articles about this. I'll put them in the chat. You guys can. Hello, you got everybody there?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay, all right. I was trying to put a link into the chat. Okay. While I'm talking, everybody can sort of read a couple articles. So, as I was saying, I think it's very, very important for African countries to make sure that to attract these foreign companies to a country. They're already attracted, but how do you focus on the validation, R&D, the commercialization, and also focus on governance? One of the things I've talked to a few officials from the U.S. government, EU, and one of the things I say to them is, look, you can be concerned about the inroads that China has made into Africa, and I don't. This China bashing, we have to also be very realistic. China only controls a quarter, less than a third of Africa's. They own or lease some of these mines in DRC or Zimbabwe. Glencore, which is a Swiss company, is there. The U.S. Multinationals have divested some of their holdings in DRC and a couple other countries, to the detriment of people at the Pentagon and the White House. They're starting to realize that was maybe a not such a smart decision. In any case, how can we ensure that we are supporting the African continent so that they realize the potential to get their house in order so that they can be in the next Southeast Asia? In the 70s and 80s, many of the Asian countries or Southeast Asian countries, focus on human development, focus on training and vocational training and R&D, and this attracted companies like JVC, Phillips, Hewlett Packard, Texas Instruments. The reason why they went to Southeast Asia because of labor arbitrage. It was just much more affordable to hire electrical engineer or a scientist at a third of a cost than hiring somebody in Silicon Valley or Fort Worth, Dallas, right? And Southeast Asia has, you have the ecosystem. You have tier 1, 2, and 3 suppliers that supply not only rare earth minerals to the semiconductors or consumer electronics sectors, but they also are building out an ecosystem to create jobs and create economies of scales and employment. Those type of things that the Western companies have done in Southeast Asia is the same thing that Africa needs to happen in Africa, right? To produce semiconductors is quite complex. There's not one country that can control the whole production of the semiconductor supply chain. It's very, very difficult. Even though the semiconductor, the wafer, the silicon chip was the Americans, we created it. The machines to actually do the etching is the top manufacturers called ASML. They're in, let me type it in. They're based in the Netherlands and Holland. Japan also make equipment. There are companies like Lam Research and others. But where does that, with all that said, how can we take advantage? If we can't make semiconductors, how can we make flash memory? I think we can. In semiconductors, you need a lot of water. You need base electricity. Most countries in Africa are power deficient by 60%. Electrical vehicle batteries, those are quite easy to make. The electrolyte is cobalt or lithium, and then you have the cathode, right? We have, till we get to solid state batteries, which are, the electrolytes actually, instead of it being liquid, most batteries, a lot of people don't realize most batteries that are made, the lithium cobalt is actually, it's in a gel form, right? There's a researcher or a scientist somewhere in the lab as we speak trying to figure out how do you get to solid state so that you can double the charge, so you don't have to charge a battery after 250, 300 miles. You could charge it every 1,000 miles, that sort of thing, right? But for me is, well, having said all that, why don't we create these opportunities on the continent? We have to look at a Africa first approach where we're convincing some of our Western countries to say, look, as a continent scales to 2.5 billion people, it's going to be a huge market. Disposable incomes are going to rise. You want to be there compared to other adversaries. And for us, it's very, very important that since Africa is now at the center of this geopolitical, in between, geopolitical candidates who are trying to secure these raw materials, Africa has to look at what's best for itself. But governance is also a play. Governance is, you have to ask yourself, after years of investment and support by multilaterals and the private sector and our institutions, how come some of these governments are still not, they're still allowing certain countries to dominate their industries? I know there's some countries in the past 14 months who have put together moratoriums or bans on certain minerals, which is good. You're solving one side of the issue, but the other side is, well, how do you attract a multinational to your country and say we want you to focus on R&D, innovation, commercialization, right? We have to think about the future, or the African continent has to think about the future. There's been some headways in the two articles I've written. I think the one article I make an argument about how Google, Alphabet Google, they have an AI lab in Ghana that's been in Ghana for about 5-6 years. Microsoft has R&D labs in Lagos and in Kenya. So it happens I was in Kenya earlier this year speaking at an AI workshop, and I actually visited the Microsoft lab in Nairobi. It's pretty impressive. IBM has been on the ground the longest with their R&D lab in Nairobi and in South Africa. So once you put an R&D lab in a country, you're saying to your stakeholders, your investors, the local community, we think there's innovation on the ground. We think there's an opportunity to not only scale innovation, but that can be utilized on the ground, but the innovation can also be used in developed markets. So that's very, very important for creating jobs, creating the governments can get tax revenue to support social programs, and also to support innovation. I mean, now if you look at a continent where it is, there's not one country that does not have some sort of an entrepreneurial ecosystem, i.e., incubator, accelerator, co-working spaces, right? These are opportunities for companies like Cisco. I had a conversation with a colleague of mine at Cisco, and I put her on the spot, say, without Africa's rare earth minerals, Cisco wouldn't have the equipment or the fiber optics needed to transmit data, right? When are you guys going to put an R&D facility in Africa? But that's convincing a company to spend millions of dollars to put in something instead of just extracting something out, right? So these are the things that I'm telling the U.S. EU governments to really secure these critical minerals, but at the same time look at Africa as a market opportunity. By year, what is it, 2040, 2050 is going to be 2.5 billion. The biggest youth population in the world. Disposable incomes will rise. This is quite important for the growth on the continent. The last thing I'll say before I finish, I'd be remiss not to say that at some point in time we need to talk about circular economy. You can't just dig all these materials up and keep digging. It's kind of like hydrocarbons. Hydrocarbons don't last forever, right? So there's one company I think out in Arizona or New Mexico that does a bit on repurposing old batteries. They refurbish it, they take the cathode out, and then they do whatever to electrolyte, whether it's lithium or nickel cadmium, what have you. Could Africa be a region where you're repurposing old batteries and reusing them for energy storage, that sort of thing? I think so. We have, if you look at most universities on the continent, 60-70% of the PhDs were educated outside of the continent. They went to universities, Imperial and Oxford, University of Michigan, and what have you. So we have uber smart engineers and scientists, right? We need to, I urge all of you guys to really push your contacts, your whoever, to say, hey, we need to focus on innovation on content. We need R&D. We need don't just focus on securing these things in Wakanda, right? We just can't. I mean, the same collaboration and partnership that Asian countries had back in the 70s and 80s, Africa needs that. This whole China plus one strategy of trying to mitigate your supply chain risk from China to India, Thailand, Philippines, Malaysia. Nobody talks about Africa. Without Africa, there won't be AI, there won't be cloud, there won't be iPhone, there won't be Tesla cars, right? So, I'm not really an extractive person. I have a very broad background in supply chain and manufacturing, mostly in the pharmaceutical industry. At one point in time, I want to talk about APIs, active pharmaceutical ingredients. China controls that. These are the main ingredients that are being used for the production of our medicines and medications. Some of these APIs, the byproduct of the plants and materials that are used for that is coming from Africa, and China is probably controlling that. We need some of that production in Africa. So I just want to leave the audience with critical rare earth minerals are not only becoming important and critical. Africa is being caught between various world powers to secure it. And I think it's very, very important that we say to these powers, well, it's good to secure it, but you also need to look at supporting the growth of continent, making sure that there's governance structures, making sure that African governments know the challenges of getting foreign direct investment. And lastly, I mean, the reason why China dominates so much with these critical rare earth minerals, they're the number one processor. I think there's like 2 or 3 countries that are processing most of these, and it's China, Australia, and Russia. And China's doing it because they don't have the stringent ESG laws like we do in the West. So I conclude my remarks. Looking forward to questions, and I'll try to answer them to the best of my ability. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Nii, for such a wonderful presentation. I think your presentation really garnered a lot of attention in the chat, where many people are putting a lot of remarks and a lot of analysis in there on the topic currently. So now we're going to move into our Q&A session. In order to make this work efficiently, I would ask that anybody who has any questions, please use the raise hand function. In order to use it, it's in one of the functions at the bottom of your screen, closer to share screen. So if you have any questions, please click on the raise hand function, and I will call on you in the order that I see your hands. So I'll give everybody a few seconds to utilize that feature, and then we'll get into the Q&A section. Great. I see a hand. Is it Aud or Aude?
Yes, hi everyone. It's Aud, yes, thank you. And sorry, I only joined just a couple of minutes ago, the discussion. So, but I've been actually involved in the chats. I responded to Neil's comments about the impact of critical minerals on communities, and it's actually quite interesting because I'm actually organizing a roundtable on this matter on Friday, with experts coming from different producer countries, from Indonesia to South Africa to Argentina, to discuss the matter. And so my question is quite simple. How do you reconcile that incentives to invest in critical mineral extraction, notably for the green transition, and the not so green side of the green transition when it comes to the impact of critical minerals on the environment, on human rights, on communities' rights, but also on conflicts? I worked in Guinea, for instance. Guinea is the primary producer of bauxite for aluminium. And in the region of Bokeh, where you find that mineral, there are, conflicts driven by this extraction for several reasons, including the fact that most of the time, communities do not receive any positive impacts from the extractions. And then obviously you have all the other health and environmental impacts of the extraction. So how do you reconcile that between, I think at the state level and the economic level, business level, that that opportunity and that search for economic gains, and on the community level, the impact of critical minerals extraction?
Yeah. So let me just rephrase your question, and then I'll try. I think that was actually maybe 2 questions, and one was, how do you rectify the divide between natural resource extraction for these critical minerals, the devastating impact to the community, and 2 was, how can you get local authorities realize that they need to put policies and frameworks in place to mitigate these challenges? Is that
exactly? And if I can just add a caveat on the second question, I mean, we know that in many of these places there are poor governance in place, and so quite realistically, I don't expect governance to magically turn good in a matter of just a few months, a few years. So I think it's also important to look at the role of international partners, whether it is at the state level or economic partners, in what they can do to ensure that critical minerals extraction doesn't have such a negative impact on the environmental communities.
Sure. Look, I'm not. We all know. So I think the reason why China is the #1 processor of critical minerals, critical rare earth minerals, and they're not just taking it from Africa. They're getting it from Brazil. They're getting it from, I mean, Vale is one of the biggest extractive energy companies. They're, taking these materials from a company like Vale, taking it to China, processing, and they don't have, China doesn't have the, I think they now are getting to this, but they don't have like an OSHA that is looking over your shoulder. If, by the way, a lot of people don't realize that anytime you have an accident or any type of accident in industrial space, workplace in the States, OSHA is not going to be there. They're going to find you. We have ESG laws. We have things here that make it very difficult to process critical rare earth minerals. There's some old silver mines in Utah and Colorado that are there, and they're now starting to realize, hey, there's actually a lot of value there. But to actually go in there and mine it, even in states that are conservative, a lot of people are like, we don't want the environmental damage. Now, with Africa, there's communities where they've been devastated. They've lost, livelihoods, agriculture, and just be in the name of these minerals. In Ghana, where my lineage is, we have something called galamsey, where people in rural areas are using mercury to get gold, right? I didn't even talk about this, but once we get to the quantum age, the amount of gold needed for the quantum computers is going to be so enormous. But on the policy side, when it comes to I don't know if I'm going to answer earlier questions, but the policy side, when it comes to labor, the human rights, Africa is not the only region that's dealing with labor issues. I mean, I know, there's challenges in Bolivia and Peru, but I think the reason why China does what it does in Africa is because they know that there's weak governance, right? That's really why it's so attractive for a country like China. Even Russia, well, Russia is just securing it. They're not processing it. They're just securing whatever, and then they'll sell to Chinese or take it back to Russia. That's a different conversation. But I'm not a governance person per se. All I know is that we need to, we need to make sure we can control our own future by focus on R&D innovation. If we have more Western companies in Africa, I'm hoping that the environmental standards will be better. That's not going to be always the case, because a lot of these companies, they've made mistakes in the past, and they've probably left the country because they've made mistakes along the way. I don't know if I answered your question.
No, thank you. I mean, I mean, actually, on your last point, I wanted to also emphasize, I mean, I don't know whether the conversation was focused on China, but I did want to emphasize that the fact that, Western countries are also involved and engaging in extractions of minerals. I mean, Canada is, for instance, a huge critical minerals, has a huge engagement on critical minerals extraction. I mean, the United States, I mean, the EU, I mean, all of these countries are also involved in this business. And actually, when it comes to having safeguarding policies, well, quite often they're not being so great, whether it is in critical minerals or other similar businesses and sectors that have an impact on the environment. So that was just my last 2 cents on the topic. Thank you very much.
Yeah, Audi, it looks like we have a bunch of mutual friends. I sent you a LinkedIn request.
I actually sent you an email as well, so that's great.
Yeah,
thank you.
We could connect offline. I'd like to hear more.
Yeah, let's do this. Yeah, and I'd be glad to invite you to the discussion on Friday.
Cheers. What time is it?
11 to noon, and I have a speaker from Indonesia, one from South Africa, and one from Argentina, and basically a bunch of experts from the Global South and the US.
All right, sounds good.
Yeah.
Cool. I think we have a couple other questions.
Yes, Neil.
Yeah, I mean, I think Aude, the point I was making in terms of, whether it's Guinea, whether it's Burkina, you mentioned, the issue of artisanal sector gold production and using mercury. And as you have this competition between China and the EU and the US, there's going to be an incentive to secure sources, and there's going to be an incentive to bribe. There's going to be an incentive to overthrow governments. We've already seen that playbook. So what are some mechanisms that we need to put in place now, either through the AU, through the UN, etc., so have a code of conduct, not a voluntary code of conduct, but a mandatory one, that, minerals which are being sourced, they can be traced, in the same way that we trace, conflict diamonds. We put these mechanisms in place so that anything that's important to the EU, anything that's important into the US, anything that's coming out of China, the source is traced. And then, those companies which don't abide by them, they're banned from those markets.
Yeah, it sounds I don't know if that was a question, Morris. I think what you did ask a question in the beginning. I'm not I'm not an expert on governance. I think, what you asked me, I think I agree with you. I think the continental-wide body like AU or, regional bodies, ECOWAS, SADC, COMESA, they need to come up with a framework on that. We all know that there are challenges with this. I mean, I just read a couple months ago that even in Indonesia, they're dealing with some of these same challenges we're dealing with Africa. And look where Indonesia is as a market, right? So so I don't know if anybody from the AU is on the call, they can answer, but I doubt that. But you're spot on. I think, as these critical rare earth minerals become, they're important now, right? I mean, as I said, everybody's talking about a net zero evolution as we try to get below 1.5 degrees Celsius.
I mean, my question is, yes, the AU, the various regional bodies, ECOWAS, COMESA, SADC, but in so much as many of those resources are being exported to the EU and the US, the EU and the US can put mechanisms in place to trace, the sources and ensure that cobalt coming from DRC isn't coming from a mine that is either engaging in widespread pollution or human rights violations, that rare earth metals or nickel or manganese coming from Indonesia or Guinea aren't being sourced from conflict areas. That's what the EU and the US can do, irrespective of what the AU and the various regional economic bodies can do.
Well, I don't know. I'm going to push you back on that. I mean, yes, you can do that, but what are we doing to the African countries? I mean, are we putting all the onus on the foreign powers? I mean, China is not doing that. The Chinese companies we know what the Chinese companies do, and if one were to say the U.S. and EU, why can't we say? I would say this. For what you're saying, that statement should say to any foreign direct investor, what's the minimum? What is the baseline? What baseline are you using for governance and accountability for extraction? And then what are your tracer materials? This is not just we all know we have Foreign Practices Act, we have Minerals Act. The West has these acts, but the thing is, will the Justice Department, will they spend time, money, and effort to send somebody to these mines to look at? That's a question. But for people from the Pentagon, I had a conversation with somebody from DOD. I'm supposed to go in there in the next few weeks to chat with them, but they're concerned about securing these things for F-35 jet and a new bomber and all these things. And Pratt Whitney needs rare earth minerals in their engines for the B-21 and F-35. I'm not sure if they're terribly concerned about the what you're talking about, but it's important, right? But you make a very, very good remarks. But I would say on a whole, right? It's not just focus on the US, EU. It's also we have to push China. So I think we have a couple other questions.
Yeah, thank you so much. And yes, in the interest of time, since we have 7 minutes left, the remaining 3 questions.
We can go over. I have time. We can go over.
Yeah, but I don't want to go over too much. So I would say maybe a few minutes over. So, but Bernard Anderson.
Yeah, Nii, great presentation. Thank you very much. I actually have several things that resonate based on a lot of things that you said. I'm a partner with a gentleman in the ECOWAS area who is the owner of a very large iron ore mine, second largest on the continent. And as you know, iron ore is a staple in infrastructure, building facilities and that sort of thing. And the other group that I'm with has a significant bid in to lay down infrastructure for internet services throughout another one of the countries and kickstart fintech, ag tech, health tech platforms on top of that. My question is, with the mines for critical minerals, most of them, as I know it, are owned by governments. Do you have relationships with the government authorities there? Let's take Ghana, for instance, who can provide some assurance and maybe N143-101 type reports for potential investors, just for transparency and give them assurance that the assets are there?
I don't have those contacts. I mean, I'm interested. I'm in this space because of my I'm in this space because of my work and what I've written about on semiconductors and flash memory and the various rare earth minerals that go into that. What you're talking about, that needs to, I would say that's it needs to come some kind of Ministry of Extractive or Energy or that sort of thing. I'm sorry, I don't know. I don't have that answer for you.
Well, you touched on incentivizing Western companies to come to Africa and set up labs and that sort of thing. Have you got any instructions on or ideas written down on how you would approach them to become interested? That would be my last question.
Sure. I am talking to a couple of companies about that. Those are private discussions, and I'm talking to DoD. DoD is I'm just saying, yeah, there's certain stakeholders around the world that are that I'm talking to, others are talking to look at that. But the angle I'm coming from is, well, to secure these things, you need to do certain things. I mean, and here's another thing. Everybody, when you talk about these things, people are going to bring up the term, or they're going to say, "Oh, AGOA." And now AGOA is great, but I don't think something like this should be included in AGOA. I'm coming from a more or less semiconductor, flash memory, electric vehicle standpoint. I think this should be a separate trade agreement, that sort of thing, where you can get a TI or a Lockheed or whatever to extend their R&D or their manufacturing footprint on the continent. Just like in India. India has Micron's open up a chip factory. They're going to start manufacturing something around a 15 or 20 nanometer chip. But the raw materials are coming from South Asia, or I'm sure some of it's coming from Africa. Those type of conversations we need to have in Africa. Even though we are part deficient, we still need to have those conversations, right? Yeah. We have a few more minutes.
Yes, well, thank you. Jacob Kerner next.
Hi, thank you. My question was, what's the biggest barrier to or the most important consideration for companies when trying to outcompete Chinese business interests at a global level?
I'm not a China expert, but I mean, I would say from, I know enough from my World Bank days. I would say, I mean, we all know this. I mean, I think we're all here foreign policy people. China, does not ask certain questions when they're trying to do business, right? So they don't have that governance framework. Although I would say last week they just finished the 10-year anniversary of the BRI, the Belt Road Initiative, and prior to that there was some talk about making a Belt Road Initiative much smaller. what is it? I heard this mantra, beautiful, smaller. They actually went big. It's not even called a Belt and Road Initiative anymore. I don't know what the new moniker is, but they're doubling down. They're putting $100 billion down to do smaller bets. But those days of just getting, building infrastructure, that sort of thing, and get whatever you want, those days are over. The Chinese government has realized that some of the loans that some of these countries have taken around the world, it's going to be very hard for some of these countries to take back. But they have their own version of their own form of governance that they're trying to right size for their own interests, right? They probably looked at what's happened in the past 10 years, and they probably know who they can work with and who they can control, and who also they can who could pay the loans going forward, right? But I mean, all nations have they all live and learn, and then they pivot, and then they course correct. China's course correcting. In 20 years, what will governance be for them? Would it be the governance that we expect here in the rule of law? I don't know.
Thank you.
Thank you. And lastly, but not least, Otis.
Hey, good morning, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you so much for your presentation. I just wanted to know, considering Western companies usually not having too much interest in long-term capacity building, as well as Chinese companies not really having too much of interest in anti-corruption policies or initiatives, what is the best case for Africa or people of Africa in this space, and trying to build up rare minerals, like considering those different issues, those different dynamics?
Could you I didn't really get your question. Could you rephrase it?
Sorry. So for usually you mentioned about capacity building. Hopefully we'll be able to do this, be able to create processing in sub-Saharan Africa. And then, but just knowing that Western companies might not have that much of interest on a usual basis, but then also knowing that Chinese companies that may do some investments in Africa in this space, they might not have the same purview or interest in anti-corruption policies or impact. I wanted to know, like, what do you think is the actual best case for people of Africa to develop more in this space?
I'm gonna try to let me rephrase your question. I think you're in essence you're saying vis-a-vis compared to the Chinese, what are how can Africans develop their own policies and frameworks that is benefit to them, by the same time develop the capacity so that they can learn from their mistakes? Is that sort of what you were telling me?
Well, just acknowledging that there's challenges trying to attract investment from Chinese companies and Western companies, because there's going to be less anti-corruption on the Chinese side, less interest in capacity building. What's realistically for Africans, like, how can they deal with these two investors in order to develop their own capacity?
Well, I mean, I think I think I said this in my remarks. I think one of the things that the African countries need to do is also build capacity. I'll give you a couple examples. Last year during the U.S. has a state summit, and this, so let's say the U.S. has a state summit. The U.S. has a state summit that was about a year ago. A lot of these African leaders were here in Washington, D.C. The U.S. government did a really great job to open up various departments to people who had meetings, Exim Bank, World Bank, USADF, that sort of thing. But a lot of these African countries did not have the capacity or the manpower to even understand or even to do deal making, right? Another example would be, during before this Belt Road forum that happened last week. Before that, the presidents of I can't even pronounce the guy's name, Sikawedi or from DRC. He has been to China several times in the past 10 months. He's been to China 3 times. The Kenyan president has been there, going there, open up their hands to beg China for money, and they just didn't have the right personnel to understand how do you manage the Chinese. What the African governments need to do, we need to have the right personnel. We need to understand how the Chinese think, because when these guys come to Africa, first of all, they're not going with a big delegation. They're going with a dozen people that can speak the language. They understand how we think, that sort of thing. And it's almost like competitive analysis. You doing due diligence. African governments need to do more due diligence. They need to put the resources to that. Now, we're running over. I'll just make this really quick. One of the things that I'm working on is one of the challenges we're having as we get to 2.5 billion in Africa is you're seeing the people who are managing the state purses. Are they managing in a way where they're thinking about the future generation, right? So I think it needs to be more leadership and governance. We need a broader coalition of women. I think if there were more women in public office, from a mayoral, provisional, state government level, they can contest the head of state. I think you'll see some of these challenges be mitigated, right? So yeah, that's what I would say to you. I hope I answered your question.
No, thank you. I appreciate it.
Welcome.
Okay, that concludes a round of Q&A. I would just like to really thank Nii Simmonds again for joining us today. We are so glad that you were able to join us this afternoon and early evening for a really wonderful lecture and Q&A on rare earths in Africa. So now for some quick closing remarks. So this is the first of our lecture series in the Africa 101 lecture series. Our next lecture is coming up on November 2, which is next Thursday at 6 p.m. with Dr. Nola Haynes, who is an international security expert. Dr. Haynes will be speaking on the challenges to international security on the African continent. I have put the link to register for that event in the chat, but you can also visit our website at iabpia.org and go to the upcoming events section, and you will see Dr. Haynes's upcoming presentation. We hope that you will be able to join us next Thursday. And we once again thank you all so much for joining us, and once again thank Nii Simmonds for presenting on rare earths in Africa today. So I just want to give a round of applause for you, Nii, for joining us today. Are there any other closing remarks you would like to give before we finish off today?
Sure. I would just say, I've been saying this for the past year. I would urge anybody listening or who's left, we need more people of color, more people of color, more underserved professionals to be in a policy space, to write policy, to influence policy. That's where I've come full circle around. That's where I'm noticing. That's where people who are at think tanks, they're writing policy, they're influencing policy. These are the people who are making decisions that are informing somebody at National Security Council or White House or the Pentagon or Capitol or the Parliament in EU. We need to look at these challenges, look at these issues, write about it, speak about it like I'm doing. And yeah, we all have to support each other. So I'll leave you those remarks. Stay blessed, stay safe, and take care. Thank you.
Thank you all so much. Thanks, everybody.